बेल आइकन दबाएं और ऑक्सफैम इंडिया के चैनल को ज़रूर सब्सक्राइब करें।
Hello and welcome to the virtual launch of Oxfam India's Inequality report on women's backs. We at Oxfam have been coming out with our inequality reports for the last few years that show how economic inequalities across the world is spiraling out of control. The rich are getting richer and the poor poorer. Now, Oxfam India came up with its first India-centric inequality report in 2018 on the widening gap between the haves and have-nots, and in 2019 on the state of jobs and employment. This year, the report on women's backs focuses on the unpaid care work and the impact it has on women. We are very fortunate to have with us today Professor Jayati Ghosh and Professor Diane Rosemary Elson for the launch and a discussion on the report. Rupali Mehra will moderate the discussion. This will be followed by a Q&A session. Also joining us is our CEO, Amitabh Beher. But first, Dia Datta, research lead at Oxfam India and the co-author of the report on women's backs, will take us through some of the key findings. Over to you, Dia.
Thanks, Sally. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Oxfam India, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule and to participate at this launch event. For the benefit of our guests, please note that the soft copy of the report is available in the handout section on the right-hand side of the control panel. You can download it at any time during the webinar. Next slide, please. I want to begin with the latest time use survey that the National Sample Survey Office of the Government of India has recently published. Please note this arrives 20 years since the last and only time use survey had been conducted in India. It reveals some startling findings about how women and men spend their time working. Women on average spend 4 hours more performing unpaid care work than men and 54 minutes more performing unpaid and paid work than men. Interestingly enough, none of this is new information for practitioners and academics working on women's labor in India. Jayati Ghosh back in 2012 had estimated that women outperform men in terms of time spent on total work. The NSSO survey merely gives official endorsement to the well-known fact of high inequality in women and men's work in India. That women work much harder than men and yet their work goes unrecognized is a well-known fact. What is important to understand is how this comes into being. The 2020 Oxfam India Inequality Report on women's backs does just that. It unpacks the underlying causes that lead to unequal and unrecognized gender division of labor in India by focusing on the inequalities arising from social norms, unpaid care work, and violence against women and girls. Next slide, please. The home is one of the most contested spaces when it comes to gender relations. It is the breeding ground for gender inequality between the breadwinner man and the homemaker woman. What makes it unequal is that because the work that women do, often back-breaking and time-consuming, is not valued as productive labor that brings income. As a consequence, their needs and rights go unnoticed. But how does it come into being? It happens through the practice of social norms, a common understanding of appropriate conduct by individuals or a group of individuals. Social norms can not only underpin human behavior, but it can keep it under check via praise and acceptance or through penalties from censure to violence. Social norms can be deeply gendered and patriarchal, where the man is viewed as the provider of the family and the woman as the caregiver subordinate. If you look at, next slide, please. If you look at the slide which lists qualities that define a good and a bad woman, and similarly for a man, you will realize that social norms that circumspect women's lives and mobility far outnumber those for men. The burden of care work is so immense that it has negatively impacted their participation in the workforce, circumscribed their pursuit of education, and discourages them from taking care of their health. In short, because of the high burden of unpaid care work, women, especially poor women, are extremely time poor. Next slide, please. In India, women's contribution to the GDP is one of the lowest in the world at 17%. Yet, if you look at the total amount of work done by women, it is much higher and contributes to a lot more to the Indian economy. In China, 41% of women's work contributes to 41% of the GDP. Eastern Europe and Central Asian countries similarly 41%. Sub-Saharan Africa is at 39%, and the world average is 37%. The unavailability of safe and paid work and the existence of a labor surplus economy, especially in rural agricultural pockets, has kept women bound to unpaid care work. Alternatively, it offers them unsafe paid work within the informal economy with no social and employment benefits and security of jobs. Added to this, their crucial role in unpaid care work is largely unrecognized. Next slide, please. We now turn to some of the findings from the field study that we did for this report. Women from materially deprived families are engaged in both unpaid and paid labor, making them extremely time poor. Men fear being shamed for doing housework, and women fear being shamed for making men do the housework. As a consequence, women perform all the unpaid care work for the family. Middle or upper class educated women in urban centers such as Delhi have the choice of outsourcing their unpaid care work responsibilities to other women from poorer families. Nonetheless, women continue to be the supervisors, coordinators, and organizers of housework done by the hired domestic helper. Among dual learner couples in Delhi, the division of housework can be less skewed, yet it is gendered nonetheless. Next slide, please. Oxfam India estimated that women and girls put in 3.26 billion hours of unpaid care work each and every day, which is equivalent to the contribution in Indian rupees of 19 lakh crore a year to the Indian economy. In this slide, you will see that we did an exercise with the rural women in Udaipur, where we asked them to list all the activities that they do from the time they get up in the morning till the time they go to bed at night. And similarly for men. And then we asked them to take out the activities which were purely for personal reasons, such as taking care of the personal hygiene, bathing, etc. Now, if you look at the slide, you will see that the amount of work that a woman does during a day far outnumbers the work that men do in the same day. The impact of this disproportionate unpaid care workload shapes directly and indirectly several other dimensions of the lives of girls and women, including opportunity costs in terms of their stunted aspirations and imaginations. Next slide, please. The study also finds an interlinkage between unpaid care work and violence against women and girls. Women's duty towards the household and the family as their prime responsibility has deep social currency. Any mistake made by women within the context can be seen as deserving of punishment meted out through violence by both men and women. Women are judged for their performance of house and care work, and non or poor performance of it can be a trigger for violence. They're humiliated, verbally and physically abused. In the next slide, we have tried to show the direct causes of violence and the triggers of violence. The direct causes of violence are more structural in nature in the society, such as unequal power relations, gender norms and beliefs, male control over decision making and resources, etc. Whereas the triggers are the non or poor performance of unpaid care work, such as mistakes in household work, unappetizing food, delay in cooking or cleaning, etc. Now, there's a deep connect between the two. I mean, one kind of reiterates the other one. Next slide, please. I want to bring your attention to a survey that Oxfam India conducted in 2019 on unpaid care work. It was a 1,000 respondent survey where 700 of the 1,000 respondents were women. What is striking about the results of this survey is that there's a very high level of acceptance of violence against women for non-performance or poor performance of care work. So for example, if a woman fails to prepare a meal for men in the family, 41% actually believe that it is justified to beat a woman for not performing her duty correctly. And 68% think it is all right to harshly criticize her for the same. Similarly, if she fails to fetch water or firewood for the family, 42% think it is justified to beat her, and 65% think that it is all right to criticize her very harshly. Next slide. Actually, leave it at this slide and let me just talk a little bit more about what I want to now talk a little bit about is two case studies from this year's report, which show how violence has become permeated into the lives of women because of their performance of care work within the household. In the first case, for more than 12 years, our respondent faced physical, emotional, and verbal abuse from her husband and in laws. At every point, she convinced herself that it was her fault, that she needed to change and not the family or her husband in particular. Awakening dawned when she realized that her two sons were getting influenced by their father and they were misbehaving with her. That is when she broke her story, sought help, and gave an ultimatum to her husband to either mend his ways or give her a divorce. This was a respondent from an upper class family in Delhi. In the other case, the cause for violence was triggered by her asking her husband to give her some money to buy things that she needed. He flew into a rage and said to her that her job was to do the work at home quietly and that she had no need to ask for money. Then he dragged her to the terrace and tried to push her over the boundary wall. Next slide, please. Now, some of the findings from the qualitative study show that 1 out of 3 women and girls have faced physical violence because of poor care work performance. 2 out of 3 women have faced verbal violence at home for the same reason. 1 out of 3 men have admitted to have been violent to their wives because of non or poor performance of care work. Women enjoy greater freedom in their natal families. Marital families are usually stricter with their daughters in law. In urban centers, delegation of work to domestic help does reduce women's burden, but doesn't absolve them of the responsibility and accountability of the care work altogether. Next slide, please. Violence against women and girls is defended on the inability to do their household chores well. Findings from the field show that men think of violence as deserving. Following are the justifications men have provided. One male respondent said that men's anger is justified to some extent. She stays at home all day, has little work to do, even then she cannot work well. Another one says, yes, household chores are a woman's work. That is how a man woman pair makes sense. A third one said, I get angry and frustrated when the wife doesn't do her work properly. A little bit of violence is normal. Another male respondent said, if she goes outside to roam around for no reason, then it is necessary that she should be hit. And finally, another male respondent said that some men hit their wives when they get angry. I only hit sometimes, like once a month. Next slide, please. So finally, we come to the recommendations from this report on behalf of Oxfam India. The preceding discussion establishes a case for widespread norm change and behavior change. This report emphasizes that to aid the facilitation of such changes, the state needs to create the conducive environment for it. Thus, our recommendations pertain to policies and initiatives that governments and non-state actors can adopt, which in turn would aid in social norm and behavior changes. First, provide public amenities, for example, water, gas stoves, and toilets, and services such as safe and accessible transport in rural areas and childcare at work sites for women to realize their rights to rest, leisure, and to participate equally in the labor market. Second, offer decent local employment, better working conditions, and fair pay for both women and men. Third, adopt and implement the International Conference of Labour Statisticians 2013 definition of work and include women's unpaid care work in national accounting mechanisms. Fourth, initiate gender sensitization and behavior change strategies in schools and colleges, thus starting as early as possible in a child socialization process, specifically messaging on redistribution of care work. And finally, run public campaigns on progressive models of masculinity and femininity based on degendered labor within and outside the household. Support NGOs and civil society organizations with strong links to grassroots communities to run extensive gender sensitization workshops to help promote gender equal norms between men and women and adolescent boys and girls in school. Thank you. That is the end of my presentation. We will now move to the keynote address by Professor Diane Elson. Let me just introduce Professor Elson to everyone. Professor Diane Elson is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex, United Kingdom, and a former chair of the UK Women's Budget Group. She is chair of the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy set up by the World Bank Group. She is also a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy, advisor to UN Women, and a former vice president of the International Association for Feminist Economists. She has published widely on gender equality and economic policy. She was awarded the 2016 Leontief Prize for Advancing Frontiers of Economic Thought by the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University. Professor Elson, a very warm welcome to you, and over to you for your address, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you going to unmute me, please?
You're unmuted. We can hear you.
Good. So it's very good to be in India again, if only virtually. And for the moment, it's the sort of virtual meetings that we have to make do with. We hope maybe next year, the year after, life will change. So first, I want to congratulate Dia and all the contributors to this report, which I think is excellent in bringing together detailed case studies and data from surveys and helping us to think more deeply about the causes. I think it's innovative in the way that it examines the interactions between women's work, both unpaid and paid, and violence against women, and the underlying behavioral norms that support the inequality of women and girls. Because violence against women is often treated separately to the issues of work. And I think it's very important to bring them together. So let me first highlight some of the findings that particularly struck me in the report, and then I'll make some remarks about how the analysis could be extended. And then I'll go on to make some suggestions about ways of changing these deep structures of inequality, picking up on some of the recommendations. So the report confirms that women in India, as elsewhere in the world, bear the major responsibility for unpaid care work, and that men tend to have no understanding of how burdensome this is. It's a little light housework. For low-income rural women, however, it's an intense physical burden, from pre-dawn to after everyone else has gone to bed, not least because of the lack of access to clean water and sanitation and energy. And I think we can deepen our understanding of the unpaid care responsibilities of low-income rural women by analysing how far this work, on top of the income-generating work, depletes their physical and mental health. I think we now have research that demonstrates that low-income rural women are not an inexhaustible resource. They suffer pain, ill health, and stress and chronic fatigue through hard physical work that never ends. And the domestic violence that this report has revealed intensifies that. So women's not only are time poor, but their physical and mental health are depleted. But nevertheless, they're always expected to be on tap when a crisis occurs, like COVID-19 and associated lockdowns, to extend their unpaid care work in order to try and help their families and communities cope. Of course, in India, in urban and middle income women have access to water, sanitation and energy, although from what I read, it's often unreliable and far from clean. But at least there is a tap, there is a switch. But as the report notes, they can outsize the remaining physical burden by employing paid domestic workers. But nevertheless, they have to take responsibility for managing that paid care work and continuing to provide emotional care to their family members. And though the report does not examine this, paid domestic work is all too often lacking in decent pay and working conditions. And I think this is something we also need to bring into discussion. I was very pleased to see some recognition of the role of paid domestic workers, because sometimes when we're talking about unpaid care work, we forget to mention that it's also a class issue, that well-off women can afford to, and not even some middle-income women can afford to employ paid domestic workers. So I do think it's important to bring their situation into the discussion. Now, if we take these urban, middle-income and higher-income women, analysis of what's happened in such households in the context of COVID lockdowns is now revealing clearly that the default responsibility for unpaid care remains with women. Advised to deny entry to their house to paid domestic workers, and with schools closed, it is women who've had to take on most of the additional unpaid care work in all the evidence I've seen. We've got a lot of evidence now for European countries that professional women trying to homeschool children as well as carry on with their professional work from home, as many of you may be doing, are finding also there is no rest at all and their careers are at risk. And I wonder if the same is true in Delhi, and whether this will enable middle income and higher income women to look afresh at the issue of unpaid domestic work. The COVID-19 lockdowns have also made clear what this report also demonstrates, that for too many women, the home is not a safe place. It is a place of fear and violence. And the report brings out that domestic violence is not just a matter of the actions of a few bad men who've had too much to drink. It's underpinned by social norms assented to by many women as well as men, that offer justifications for domestic violence, including a woman's failure to perform their unpaid domestic work to the required standard. I wonder if there would have been the same assent to the idea that employers are justified. I wonder if there would have been the same assent to the idea that employers are justified in bullying and beating male workers if they fail to perform work to the required standards. Exploring this question might give us a deeper understanding of social norms about acceptable violence and help put them in question, and to understand how domestic violence is embedded in a violent society and a violent economy, where violence is perpetrated by men not only against women and children, but also against less powerful men, and where violence is structured by gender, class, caste, ethnicity, and sexual identity. As this report shows, women also face harassment and violence in paid work. Paid work opportunities may allow women to escape violence at home, but it may be a case of out of the frying pan into the fire, as urban women face harassment and violence both in the workplace and on the journey to work. And yet, though the social norms revealed in this report are strong, they are contestable and they are being contested, and they may be changing for younger generations. I was struck by the case of Gangabai, who was finally able to stand up to her husband and, with the support of her growing children, to prevail upon him to stop the violence, mobilizing the argument that his violence was getting the family a bad reputation that would harm the marriage prospects of his daughter and his son. So here we have a case where male violence is seen to have negative repercussions, and there's a disapproval of this from the younger children. Now, this case might be an outlier now, but it's perhaps a pointer to future change. Although social norms are important and strong, they are fragmented, they do change, and people do resist them. So let me turn now to ways in which these deeply entrenched structures of gender inequality might be weakened. I'll just mention three that build on the recommendations of the report. Public investment in infrastructure and services and decent local employment, as recommended by the report, is vital. And feminist economists in many countries are making the case for this with quantitative analysis showing the high returns from this investment in terms of building human capacities and providing the conditions for inclusive, egalitarian and sustainable growth among the countries where this research has taken place: South Korea, Turkey, South Africa, Colombia, as well as some European countries. And I think this kind of analysis showing the returns to this investment is probably more powerful than trying to change what is measured in the GDP. You can change that measure, but it may not have any actual impact on the policy. Of course, as well as assuring the allocation of funding for this kind of investment, it's vital that investment should be democratically planned and implemented, with women well represented at every stage of the process. And from what I read, Kerala might have some useful lessons on this, but there's also some interesting things going on in Latin America you can find out about by reading the reports of the Economic Commission for Latin America, where Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Argentina are now talking much more about investment in the care economy. I'll briefly mention two other points. I think from one of the lessons I draw from the report is that we have to imagine together a different future, because lasting change doesn't come without people being supported to discuss and develop ideas on how things can be different and how norms can change. But I'm not convinced that formal education in schools and colleges is the best way to do this. I think people need to be enabled to reimagine rather than being told they should do things differently. And I was intrigued by the diagnostic research tool mentioned in the report, which had 4 components: discussing gender norms, quantifying unpaid care work, Viginette, little stories on sexual harassment at work and domestic violence at home, and brainstorming strategies for change. And this seemed to me to have promise, not just as a research method for focused discussion groups, but as a process for imagining together a different future, men as well as women. And I'd encourage Oxfam India to make creative use of this in future work with the communities it serves. Final point I want to make is about collective action to set and implement new standards. If new imaginings are to gain ground and new norms become established, they have to be followed by collective action aiming to set new standards and to hold powerful actors to account for complying with these standards. New standards can be set in a variety of ways: new laws, procedures, plans, budgets. But there must be ways of challenging non-compliance. Otherwise, the standards remain on the page in the document and they're not actually translated into action. Now, you in India will know best where there are opportunities to do this, to set these new standards and focus on implementing them, often at local or state level. But these efforts may be strengthened by new international standards that may be helpful in enabling campaigners to link together across national boundaries and to learn from one another and to hold governments to account in international fora. So I just end by mentioning 2 ILO conventions that it may be worth thinking about and finding out about what women's organizations in other countries are doing in organizing around these conventions, or how far this is already going on in India. One is the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers, adopted in 2011. This covers paid domestic workers, and it includes a statement that each member shall take measures to ensure that domestic workers enjoy effective protection against all forms of abuse, harassment, and violence. And I know there's a lot of work already going on internationally around this convention. More recently, just last year, there's an ILO convention more broadly on violence and harassment in the world of work, which has a particular focus on gender-based violence and harassment. And it doesn't just apply to formal workplaces, it applies to informal workplaces and traveling to and from work. Again, it does not specifically cover unpaid domestic work, although it does call upon governments to recognize the effects of domestic violence and to mitigate the impact of this on the world of work. Now, these conventions are not magic bullets that can immediately destroy structures of inequality, but they are providing the focal point for collective organizing in a variety of countries, reassuring women they're not alone in trying to institutionalize new norms that offer alternatives to old norms and providing a space for mutual learning. Let me end by congratulating Oxfam India once again on this excellent report, and to urge all of you who are participating, who have been listening to us so far, and we hope to hear from you in the Q&A, to encourage all of you to draw on this as a resource for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Elson. That was a very powerful discussion, speech that you just gave us. Let me move on. We now have a conversation between Rupali Mehra and Professor Jayati Ghosh and Professor Diane Elson. Let me introduce Rupali to our audience. Rupali Mehra is the founder of Content People AB, an impact communications company specializing in communication strategy, video storytelling, campaigns, events, research, and workshops. Content People AB works with a range of clients from media to the development sector in Scandinavia and India. Rupali launched Content People AB after 2 decades in the media space. She has worked with media houses like Reuters, NDTV, and Times Now. She has also executed communications projects for multilateral institutions like USAID, Nordic Council, and Visit Sweden. Rupali's work has been recognized in India and abroad. She has won the Commonwealth Vision Award, the Indian Television IT Award, and was shortlisted for the New York Festival Awards. Rupali has been invited to speak at various fora in India and Sweden. She has moderated panels involving government and civil society stakeholders on a host of issues including gender, sustainability, youth, and technology. Rupali hosts a regular talk show, First Post Conversations. She also writes for Swedish and Indian media houses, including the local Huffington Post, Mint, Condé Nast, and Governance Now. Rupali divides her time between Sweden and India. Rupali, very warm welcome, and over to you now.
Well, thanks a lot, Dia, and thanks a lot, Amitabh, for inviting me. Absolutely fantastic report. In many ways, it's been an eye-opener. In many ways, it's also reaffirming what we have seen with our own eyes, what we know, what we see but don't talk about. So several layers in that report, but I'm glad this conversation is taking place. Well, across the world, women do more unpaid care and household work than men. As your report highlights, in India, the gap is as high as between 8 to 10 times. And this also often means that women let go of their personal time for leisure, for education, self-development, and professional growth. Now, how can the load of unpaid care work be shared in a more equal manner? And that's a question that we really need to keep grappling with and keep talking about till we sort of reach some sort of a gender parity in sharing the load. Now, are there small nudges that we constantly need to make? Are there small interventions that will help bridge this divide? Or do we need large-scale policy changes? And also, how have the dynamics changed in the wake of COVID-19? And to help us make sense of this ground reality of unpaid care work, who better than two leading professors who are here with us in this field, Emeritus Professor Diane Rosemary Elson and Professor Jayati Ghosh. Well, Professor Jayati Ghosh has taught economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi for now nearly 35 years, and we hear that she will soon be joining University of Massachusetts in the United States. You will be missed here in India for sure, Professor Ghosh. She has authored and edited 19 books and nearly 200 scholarly articles. Professor Ghosh has received several prizes, including for distinguished contributions to the social sciences in India, the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Research Prize, as well as the Nord-Sud Prize for Social Sciences. She has advised governments in India and across the world and consulted for international organizations as well, including the ILO, the UNDP, the UN Women, as well as is a member of several international commissions. Professor Ghosh writes regularly for popular media, including newspapers, journals, and blogs. And we in fact look forward to your writings and your new thought that you do share with all of us. Professor Emeritus Professor Diane Elson, who was introduced and is with us right now for this discussion as well, is a well-known economist, a sociologist, and gender as well as a development social sciences. She is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex and former Professor of Development Studies at the University of Manchester. She's also advisor at the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women. So welcome, professors. I can go on with the reading about the work that you've done, but let's get started with the discussion. And in fact, the next half an hour, we will look to understand the issue better, which has been highlighted in the report, both from a research lens as well as the ground realities and the contextual realities. And towards the end of the discussion, we'll try and explore possible solutions, policy interventions, pathways ahead. We will also, of course, share the results of the poll that was conducted in the beginning of this event. So the forum for questions is open to the audience. Keep those questions coming in as well. I'd like to start with the statistics that really stand out in the beginning of the report, which say that women in India spend 312 minutes a day in urban areas and 291 minutes a day in rural areas on unpaid care work. Men correspondingly spend 29 minutes in urban areas and 32 minutes in rural areas on unpaid care work. So each and every day, effectively, women are spending about 10 times more doing unpaid work, doing the household work than men. Professor Ghosh, for women and girls who bear the load of this unpaid care work, what does this time poverty really translate into, both in the rural context as well as in the urban context?
Well, Rupali, I think already this was explained very brilliantly by the introduction, the Dia's presentation, and by Diane, because I have to also say it's such a pleasure to hear Diane speak. It always brings everything together so comprehensively. But I think Diane pointed this out, that, you know, it's not just a question, I mean, it's absolutely a question of time poverty, the physical strain, the fact that this can become effectively an impossible burden that impacts your health, your mental stability, and many other things. It also has a much larger dimension in terms of the impact on the labor market, because once you have this unpaid to paid kind of continuum, once you have a whole lot of women doing so much unpaid work and every woman doing so much unpaid work, then society values the work of women less in general. So that when women do enter the labor market, they are automatically assigned lower wages. When they do, the occupations that they work in tend to become the lower paid occupations, so that even men working in those then get a wage penalty. And of course, this is a massive subsidy to the national economy, as Dia was mentioning, that it actually underwrites the operations of what is the recognized economy in a very, very big way, but in a completely unrecognized way, which also then means that really it can continue to sort of persist, because women can continue to be undervalued as the work they do and their existence is not seen as contributing to the economy and society. I would just like to highlight one. I really enjoyed this report because, you know, when you look at them as a group, the Oxfam India reports of the last 3 years, they have really brought various aspects of women's work into a highlight, and I think that's excellent. For example, the earlier reports talked about different kinds of paid work of women and different kinds of, you know, like resource gathering work of women and so on. I think that this brings out to this particular report, I think, is so interesting to me, because it highlights a point that Diane has been making over the years as well in her own work, that patriarchy and all these other relational inequalities are ultimately also about the control over labor power. That's really what they're about. And of course, patriarchy is very good because you can use social mores, tradition, and all of these things which are internalized by women. This report highlights that when all that doesn't work, there's always violence as a disciplining device. And you can then get women to internalize that the violence is also okay as a disciplining device, which is the sort of horrifying thing revealed by the surveys, that even women, a significant proportion of women think it's fine to be beaten up because you're not making food for a male member of the family, or that you even go out without the man's permission. So I think the nature of this economy that we have, which is so fundamentally based on inequality, and the fact that you are then using that huge combination of social and cultural norms to reinforce that deep inequality, because this economy would collapse without all that social reproduction work. I think that is really highlighted very well in this report, and of course is a major theme of Diane's contributions over the years.
Well, Jayati, that's an important point that you've raised, the ramifications really of unpaid care work, or how it translates into both the care, paid work that women do, as well as their cultural as well as sociological context, and the value really that that women both derive, as well as their value which is seen in society. I will touch upon the Indian context a little more, but I want to sort of broaden it a little and bring Professor Diane Elson in as well. Professor Elson, there's also been what we see in India is also seen globally. The UNDP 2018 study, for example, on unpaid work shows that no country in the world really has managed to achieve equal unpaid care work. Now, there are, of course, outliers. Scandinavia is far better off. The reports here on gender equality, of course, present a slightly different picture than what we do see in India. But on an average, women still do 3.2 more times the unpaid care work as done by men. Are the ramifications of such inequalities similar across cultures and countries that you have studied?
There are some similarities. I think there are perhaps some differences too. The kind of similarities are the way that this disproportionate burden confines women's lives, constricts women's lives, and leads to the ramifications that Jayati was. Great pleasure to be on this panel with Jayati. He's an old friend. There was outlining in terms of when women do get paid work, what the implications are for that. But I think there's also implications for men. There are implications for men of not doing much of the unpaid care work, particularly when we're talking about the care work, not the burdens of fetching fuel and water. I'm sure men are very glad that they don't have to do so much of that. But the ability to spend time with your children, for instance, taking care of them, helping them with their homework or their sports activities. And I think that men's lives also get shaped in detrimental ways by this unequal division of unpaid care work. They also are confined and constricted. And I think if we're going to get more equal sharing of this work, and we're going to build upon the fact that actually around the world there are lots of younger men who want to spend more time taking care of their children, taking care of their elderly parents. Not just in Europe, we see a lot of this in Latin America, and I think in some countries in Africa too. We have to have policies that change the way that men's employment is structured, that enables men to have time to spend with their children. That means their families can survive without this division of male breadwinner, female caregiver. And that means changing the incentives and the structures that shape men's lives as well as women's lives. And I think perhaps we haven't put enough attention on that, on shaping. We're really going to get a more equal distribution of unpaid care work between men and women. We have to talk about the way in which the world of work for men needs reshaping their paid work, the way that businesses, employment, the way that men are often, even if they want to take more time to share the unpaid care work more equally, are not able to, because in order for their families to survive, they have to work long hours, or in order for them to progress in their careers, they have to show up at work for long hours. I think we also need to think a bit more about that.
Right. Jyoti, do you think that policy interventions when it comes to the labor force, the workforce in general, and let me bring it to the urban context in India. So if we were talking about, say, parental leave, and that is equalized, so men are also being brought in into the picture. And do you think these interventions will actually help tilt the balance and especially the gap in unpaid care work in India? Because we're also talking about a cultural context in India, so there are several more layers.
You're absolutely right that there are many layers, but it's also that, you know, such interventions apply to less than 2% of the workforce. And so when the dominant employment is completely the other way, then privileging a tiny section is not going to make much difference. So I think one big thing, of course, is that, you know, I find that government policies on this so completely hypocritical, because while they announce these things for, you know, certain kinds of formal sector workers, their own employment strategies actually do not treat women as equal workers. So government, the central government runs essential programs like child nutrition, maternal health, healthcare, the National Health Mission. All of these run on women who are not treated as regular workers, as voluntary workers who are paid a fraction of the minimum wage, given huge responsibilities, given no kinds of legal or social protection, and have, you know, I mean, it's actually appalling that public policy can find that it's okay to employ women in these ways and then say, all right, give equal, you know, pay for men and women during childbirth or something. So it's deeply hypocritical.
At a policy level, what would be, say, if there were one or two interventions that you would like to suggest? What would they be?
Well, the first and most
immediate
immediate,
context of India in mind, not just the 2%.
Recognize all, for public sector, recognize all the women who work for you as workers. That means give them at least the legal government minimum wage, provide them with all the proper terms and conditions that men workers get automatically. Do not run your entire health, nutrition, etc., childcare programs on unpaid or underpaid women's workers. That's number one, is the absolute essential. Number two, massively expand the public employment in care activities. We really underprovide care. We have, you know, less than one per population in terms of public employees dealing with care, whereas Sweden, I think, has more than 10 per 100. So we really underprovide care. Let's begin by just filling all the vacancies existing today in government. That already gives you 14 million more employment tomorrow, if you could actually just fill the vacancies. But we actually have to expand that number massively, get to something like the global norm of care workers per population, whether it is childcare or education or elderly care or any of these. You can't do it without people. Care is one of those activities. It's fundamentally relational. You have to have the people there. You can't do it with technology. You know, get your healthcare through a smartphone and so on. So employ many more people in proper conditions, not this kind of barefoot nurse, barefoot doctor, barefoot teacher, barefoot health worker, who are without any legal and social protections. These are the obvious low-hanging fruit that have to be done immediately. There are many, many more things, but these are the very obvious ones.
Right. I'm going to, at this point of time, throw some focus back on the report by Oxfam and pick up a quote from that. It says the normalization of social norms pertaining to gender division of labor is so pervasive that women, especially rural women, tend to justify men's work as hard work and women's work as inconsequential. And I think there are examples with the elderly women from a Dalit community in Udaipur, where women were expressly uncomfortable to talk about women's unpaid care work, which they thought was natural, compulsory, and not even worth talking about or wasting time discussing. And you also spoke about earlier, Professor, you had spoken about the India Household Care Survey of 2019, which found that households where men and women express greater acceptability of beating women, women spend 42 minutes longer on paid and unpaid care work and 48 minutes less on leisure activities. Now, the report establishes what is being seen as a crucial link between unpaid care work and violence against women and girls. Professor Elson, in your experience, have you seen this kind of a correlation across different countries, where the more the unpaid care work, the less the time for leisure, and less personal time, less time for growth of women, and more violence against women?
I don't think it's that simple. I don't think if you look at countries, look at Sweden, I think you're in Sweden now, where indeed the amount of time that women spend on unpaid care work and the gap between the time they spend and the time that men spend is a lot different to India. They spend less time, both men and women, and the gap between them is narrower. But you still got domestic violence in Sweden. Right. So you can't expect that this is somehow by itself going to reduce domestic violence. I think I'd pick out the word that was used in the report, trigger, that this was a trigger for domestic violence, but there can be many triggers for domestic violence. And when you've reduced the amount of unpaid work and you've got it more equally shared, there are still other triggers that may trigger domestic violence. So I think it's important to see those links, but it's important not to think that domestic violence will be automatically reduced if you reduce women's unpaid care burden. The fights, the violence is often about sexuality, it's about money, it's about status and esteem, all of which can be there even if the unpaid work is reduced. So we also have to have specific policies for addressing domestic violence, as well as recognizing that it has links with what happens in the household. And one important trigger is this: you've not put a good meal on the table by the time I've come home. And you see that all around the world. But I think seeing it as a trigger rather than as if this is removed, there wouldn't be any domestic violence.
Right. Also back home in India, Professor Ghosh, while self-help groups and women collectives there have been significant improvements in how women negotiate their space, both in the social context as well as the economic context. And this would hold for, say, rural as well as urban India. Often men and boys are left out of the conversation, as fathers, as young students, as young boys and grandfathers. So then one grows up with the same patriarchal attitudes as the previous generation. Now, as a gender sensitization intervention, if we were to look at threads that we can take away from the report, now, how important is it to include, say, boys in the conversation right at the university and school level itself? And do you think mapping the value of this unpaid care work can actually be one of the subjects or sub-subjects of economics and other subjects that are taught at the education level?
Absolutely, I think it's very, very important. But I would argue that it has to actually be much broader. If you look at the school curriculum, if you look at textbooks in India, they're dreadful. They're patriarchal even in progressive states. I mean, of course, now they're colored in all kinds of other ways, religious hatred, etc., etc. Differences are promoted in all kinds of ways. But our school textbooks are very, very patriarchal. This is imbibed by men, by girls and boys from a very, very early age. And it's just, so, then hitting them with a separate little gender sensitization course in college that no one is going to take seriously anyway, that doesn't really have much impact, especially when it's an add-on to everything else that they're being fed. So I think it needs a much more fundamental restructuring of the way in which we design the school education and the curriculum and syllabus from the very beginning.
Right. Okay, so I know that we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask people to put in their questions as well. And I think Dia can share it with me on the chat. So if we do get more questions, we will sort of ask both our professors who are live with us now for the Oxfam release. But also, Professor Ghosh, if I can ask you this, and I'll come to Professor Diane after that. At a policy level, do you advocate including women's unpaid care work into, say, accounting mechanisms? And how does one really account for the value of that work? And how will it help in, say, improving the situation for women economically as well as socially?
So, this is, of course, a huge debate, I think, among feminist economists, whether you need to have them included in the system of national accounts or whether you have even a parallel shadow set of accounts that includes them. I'm not a big fan. For one thing, I think even that system of national accounts sucks, right? GDP as a measure of anything material well-being is very poor. It really doesn't tell us anything about material well-being. And for many, many different reasons, which have been talked about at length, there have been excellent global commissions, the Sen-Stiglitz Commission with Fitoussi and others, many attempts to move away from GDP. This is just reinforcing GDP, in fact, by saying, well, let's do everything that women do and add it to GDP and say, look, we're actually worth something because it's worth this much. I think that's completely wrong. With respect to care work, I mean, Diane said it brilliantly decades ago, right? You have to reduce, first you have to recognize, you have to reduce the unpaid, you have to redistribute it between the family, the community, the state, and other private workers, as well as within the family. You have to represent care workers. You have to recognize, you have to give them voice. So there are many ways to deal with this huge burden of unpaid care. Saying, oh, look, you're worth this much because we are valuing each hour at the minimum wage rate, and therefore that's what you're worth. No, I do not see that as either a policy solution or as a way that would actually mobilize a lot of people into recognizing it. So I personally am not a fan. I think the steps that were outlined by Diane decades ago, and I would go with those.
Right. Professor Diane Elson, would you like to add to that? I know that you are not too much of a fan as well of this kind of budgeting mechanism.
Yeah.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
I absolutely agree with Jayati. I think it's a mistake to focus on GDP and on how better to measure it. The commission I've just chaired in the UK, which is set up by the UK Women's Budget Group, by the way, not the World Bank, on a gender equal economy, we came to exactly the same conclusion as Jayati. We don't want to reinforce GDP, we want to go beyond GDP. And we also came to the conclusion that if you want to change economic policy decisions, that's not the way to go. It's important to look at concepts like efficiency and productivity and unpack those, and skill, and unpack those if we want to really bring about change in economic policy. Just saying we need to add something to the GDP isn't going to do that.
Right. We also did a poll, in fact, earlier at the beginning of this seminar, and if we can throw up the answers, we had asked that how much more time do women spend than men in unpaid care work. So it will give us an idea of really what the perception is of how much work men think they do, women think they do, and what the ground reality is. So whenever we are ready with those answers, we'll put those out. But Professor Elson, for India, the context really gets a little different when we are talking about the professional sector in urban areas. When we are talking about the large rural economy that really pushes the wheels in India. Sometimes, say if we were just to measure how changes are to be take place, they may throw up very different results than, say, what urban versus rural contexts show up. So how does one really grapple with this complexity?
I've always thought, and I've learned from talking to Indian colleagues like Jayati and others who work on these issues in India, that I would start off with things like investing in water and sanitation and energy, for rural women, I wouldn't start raising questions immediately about equal distribution within the family. I would start with, how do we reduce these backbreaking burdens that the report brings out through public investment? I would start there. And I think the points that Jayati's made about the case in India, where a lot of women working actually in public services and not getting well paid, I mean, not getting proper pay at all, and somehow regarded as voluntary workers, I think that is a key point to address. And if you look at countries like Sweden, they didn't go straight for policies that tried to give equal parental leave. That came much later. First, they made sure they'd invested in a good system of social protection and public services and reduced inequalities overall. And then within that, to make sure they had policies that got away from this male breadwinner dependent homemaker model. So I think you have to take it in stages, and you need a lot of big picture policies as well as particular interventions on things like parental leave. You do need those eventually, and they've done very well on those in the Nordic countries, but they prepared the ground for that by investing in a good welfare state and making sure they had an effective tax system. So I think those issues, these macroeconomic and sectoral issues, are also very much related to this issue of how do we enable those women that are there in the report get out of this back-breaking work that at the moment they see no way out of.
Right, and I'm going to put the last question that to Professor Ghosh. Professor, there are policy interventions that you suggested at a broader level. One also talks about if one is to look at a more sort of a equitable welfare system, then very often it's also about the economics between gender and who really holds the purse strings, who really controls, say, the money that comes into banks. One example from Scandinavia is that when bank accounts were, say, distinguished between, instead of having a bank account for a family, it was actually segregated between specifically for men versus women and children, and subsidies went to them directly. It changed the social equation. Do you think something like this would work in India, Professor Ghosh?
Well, we already have examples. The Rural Employment Guarantee, which, as you know, disproportionately employs much more women than was originally actually expected. And that the money goes directly into bank accounts of the individual worker. That there's already evidence, a number of studies that show that this made a very, very big difference. First of all, women got access to banks, which they didn't have. Secondly, it was their own money, and they had control over that money. It was in the states where this has been well implemented, it's made a very, very significant change already. So yes, I mean, that's evident. There's a lot of case for when you do give cash transfers that you give it to women rather than to the head of the household, so-called, and so on. I think a lot of these will vary in terms of, exactly what, because we know that conditional cash transfers, again, often put additional burdens of time, at least in Mexico and other places, on women to do various unpaid work for the community and so on. But in general, the fact of individual payments to individual bank accounts, it's undeniable. And we have very strong evidence of it, not just in Sweden, but now even in India. Right. I just want to add one thing, since you said this is the last. I just want to make one addition, which I think this is an excellent report with lots of very good recommendations. One aspect which you, I'm sure, thought of, but just perhaps we didn't put in so much, is protection of victims of violence. We've had a Verma Commission report which specified very clearly what needs to be done, but nothing has been done about this. We don't have adequate shelters for women who are forced to leave home. We don't have counseling of the families. We do not have adequate punishment of the perpetrators. And therefore, the social norms get massively reinforced by the legal structures. And we know that our legal and institutional structures are terribly patriarchal, so that victims of domestic violence feel that are very unsafe to go and express this even outside, but also that they would actually give themselves, make themselves subject to further violence if they do. So I think that's an aspect that we also need to address urgently.
A very valid point there. And before I thank you all and close this discussion, I'm going to quickly see if we can pull up the poll here. I can see some of the results on the side, and to the question that how much more unpaid care work do women do versus men in families, and a majority have said 10 times more in India. So, but interestingly, very interestingly, we also have about 28% replying that maybe just 2 times or 5 times. So it's also an issue of perception, isn't it, professors? With that, I'm going to hand it over.
This is self-selected. The people who are listening to this webinar already think that a lot of women do much more unpaid work.
Yeah, that is true. So perhaps that's the percentage that we are seeing in this poll. But thank you so much, Professor Jayati Ghosh. Thank you, Professor Diane Elson. Very valuable points there in taking this discussion forward and taking our thought process forward as well. I'm going to hand it over now to Amitabh Bihar, the CEO of Oxfam India, and a guiding light, I believe, for this report. Amitabh.
So thank you, Rupali. And Jayati ji, point absolutely well taken. Yeah. This is the self-selected audience. And it would be really good to actually do this poll in a more random conversation. And maybe, Rupali, when you're doing your regular shows, if you are able to do a poll of this kind, I think it would be fascinating to hear just from even an English-speaking audience, if they could respond to it. My sense is it's going to be very different from what we have seen at the moment. So, you know, we did this report this year, earlier this year at Davos as Oxfam International Report. And as everybody knows, we do the Inequality report. And this year, the focus was unpaid care work. And I was at Davos, so I could see that there was tremendous interest around unpaid care work. And in fact, that inspired us to do that report for Oxfam India as well. But what was very, very clear is that when you look at the question of unpaid care work, as all of you have talked so eloquently, ultimately it's a question of patriarchy. It is a question also of discrimination. And when we come to the story in India, it is also about then looking at intersectionality. So it is going to be, you know, that's ultimately the complex questions and the nuances that we need to look at inequality in India. We will need to look at religious inequality. We certainly will need to look at caste inequality. We'll need to look at ethnic, more the Adivasi, the indigenous people inequality. So it does come together. I do think that this report in many ways is a beginning for us. And thank you, Jayati ji, for again flagging that there is continuity in the 3 reports. But I just wanted to use this opportunity to actually share with everyone that Oxfam India is now moving with a new strategy plan, and in which inequality is going to be our central pillar. But building on that central pillar, we realize that in India, if we don't also, particularly with the current political climate, if we don't make discrimination also as one of the central pillars, we'll probably not be able to make much headway. So the lay of our strategic plan is to actually look at gender justice, inequality, and discrimination as really the fountainhead of whatever we'll do, and then we work on questions of climate justice, etc. So that's where we are, and as the people here, most of you would know, but I just want to say that, you know, the way Oxfam works, the idea is to build on people's power. We do want to work on public narratives, but we also believe that ultimately it's the mobilization of people's power, working with partners, working with the affected communities themselves. That is what is going to deliver the change. So we are working with that framework. We continue doing our humanitarian work. But these are tough times for us. Any help from all of you is going to be very, very welcome, both in terms of ideas, as in the core principles are non-negotiable for us. And how do we continue working without compromising our commitment to a gender-just society, a society where there's no discrimination, is going to be challenging. But I think that's what we need to invest in. Let me just thank everybody. Okay, so I just get this interesting message. So I doubt I'll be able to do that now. I just got a message from Tejas saying that there's some questions, Rupali. We wanted to take those questions. So we are out of time. So if it's all right, should we leave them? We just try and Dia, you could respond to those questions, share it with Jayati ji.
Respond to the question.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. So let me just thank Professor Elson. Really kind of you to give us time. You're an absolute champion and pioneer of this work. The take home for me is what I had read many years ago, but honestly I didn't remember that it was your framework. The recognize, reduce, redistribute, and represent. If those were the 4 ones, if I remember correctly. So you've done brilliant work. Thank you for giving us time. We'll keep coming back to you, and really thank you for pushing this discourse. Jayati ji has been obviously a guide for us. She's been reviewing our reports. Even on this report, she's really been walking with us, helping us look at both the big picture and also the specific picture. And Jayati ji, do come back soon. And we are together in the fight.
I'm with him anyway. Yes.
Yes, you're here with us. And Rupali, a very big thank you. You are not in India at the moment, but you so readily agreed. Really grateful for your time and also the fantastic work you've been doing, particularly post COVID. We've been looking at the stories of change that you've been talking of. So really wonderful to have you with us. Dia, thank you. And everybody in the team who have worked on this report. So thank you, everybody. Do have a look at the report. If you can't access the report right now online, do write to us and we'll send you a copy. Thank you and bye-bye.